Pass it to me. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, everybody will.
You've probably heard the stereotypes.
We give you top secret massage.
How did Ryan use it as an object?
As an object.
Ryan used me as an object.
Come on. Do math.
We're submissive or desexualized, apparently all great at math and all look alike.
Sorry, man. Oh, y'all look alike.
Here's the thing, we're not all crazy rich Asians. You might have heard of the model minority myth. It claims the Asian American Pacific Islander community is the best minority, the hardest working, and the one that causes the least amount of trouble. But in reality, it's extremely harmful, driving a wedge between the AAPI community and their fellow American.
This time, a man stabbed in the back in Lower Manhattan.
We begin with that horrific, unprovoked attack on an Asian American woman in Hell's Kitchen.
The city is launching a new campaign to try and stop the rash of attacks targeting Asian Americans.
The guy just peeked out of the coffee shop and he goes, "I'll F you up."
She is still in shock. She's glad that she's alive.
Suddenly, I just feel my head got hit by something.
Bleeding lot from the brain. It looks like, pumping out.
I didn't think it was so close to home, and now I'm afraid to go out.
Oh my God, thank you.
Asians becoming victims of senseless crime.
I was scared because I thought I was gonna die, and nobody helped me.
Damn it, I am so sick of standing here demanding something to be done for my people.
The model minority myth, also a stressful burden to live up to, one that can cause depression, anxiety, sadness, and despair.
We have to do better.
We are here for you.
1 in 5 Asian Americans living in poverty and fighting for the safety of their communities.
No new jails! No new jails!
Shame on you for making money off the backs of people of color!
This is not your model minority, Shattering the Myth. Welcome to this very special town hall discussion. I am Eyewitness News reporter CeFaan Kim, and we are not your model minority. Let's shatter the myth. We may be closing out Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but this conversation about our lives, the lives of Asian Americans, the lives of Americans must continue. We're going to dive into a number of important issues impacting the community, not just here in New York, but across this country, like cultural stigmas that prevent the AAPI community from talking about real struggles, mental health, poverty, and of course, the community has been trying to find its footing after an explosion of anti-Asian hate crimes. How are victims coping? How are they moving forward? How are their loved ones, the community, moving forward? And like many disenfranchised communities, the AAPI community too grapples with policies that from the community's point of view is not in its best interest. In San Francisco and Seattle, it might be how cities address the homeless crisis at the expense of Chinatowns. In Washington and perhaps soon in Philadelphia, it's a major sports arena built in the community. Here in New York, the closing of Rikers Island means a jail being built in Chinatown. Today, we're joined by a group of incredible panelists. Noel Quintana, a hate crime victim. Liz Kari, president of AAPI I Belong. Ju Han, deputy director at the Asian American Federation. Dr. Shin Hee Han, a psychotherapist who works at the New School University's counseling services. Jan Lee with Neighbors United Below Canal. And council member Christopher Marte from District 1. Thank you all for being here. But before we begin, I want to invite WABC President and General Manager Marilu Galvez to say a few words.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to WABC. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And there is so much to celebrate. Beautiful cultures and traditions are a vital part of our nation's fabric, but there's also a lot of work to be done. And that is why discussions like the one we are having today are so very important, not only to educate our audiences, but also to come up with solutions to the issues our communities face. We stand against violence and discrimination, and we stand against stereotypes and myths. Let's hope that this program will help to make a difference. Thank you for your time, and have a great discussion.
Thank you, Marilu. Now, throughout today's discussion, we'll have a QR code along the bottom of your screen. Just scan it to learn more about our panelists and the many resources their groups offer to help and educate people about the AAPI community. No matter who you are or where you're from, there is something here for you in today's discussion. So let's get started.
Whenever I go outside, it's just like this feeling of despair. I see just a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of cars. Don't know what's gonna happen.
16-year-old Mickey Lee was born and raised in Chinatown. It's home, yet she avoids stepping outside, trapped in her own apartment at the mercy of her anxiety.
My family, they don't really understand mental health, and they dismissed it. For me, it was kind of just like, it's a thing that annoys my family. It's a thing that burdens my family when I get like anxiety attacks.
Mickey also comes from humble beginnings.
I recently learned like Applebee's is apparently not fancy.
None of the kids had memories of vacations. You had different memories. Tell me about that.
So I had memories of going to the sweatshop with my mom.
Mickey is far from alone. There are more than 175,000 AAPI students in New York City public schools. That's as many AAPI students as in Boston, Atlanta, St. Louis, and San Francisco have combined. According to the mayor's office, more than 21% of them are living in poverty. That's more than 1 out of 5. And almost half of them live in homes with adults who don't speak proficient English. The leading cause of death among AAPI adolescents ages 10 to 19 is suicide.
I think the myth of model minority is causing lots of harm to our youth. So like if they don't get into a specialized high school, that's a failure. If they don't get into a prestigious college, that's a failure.
Ivy Lee is the Associate Director of Mental Health for Apex for Youth, an organization that connects mental health and mentorship to support AAPI youth like Mickey. Lee says the model minority myth makes teens like Mickey question their sense of value. But with the support of Apex for Youth, Mickey found a mentor and a friend.
She's built a lot of confidence in how she speaks about herself, almost like a little leader where like she'll help like start the conversation if no one's raising their hand to speak.
In Apex, they don't see me as like doing anything wrong when I get nervous, when I have some issues. And
what's that feel like?
It feels like family.
Now, look, it's important to note that May is also Mental Health Awareness Month, and those statistics, I still can't get over that. Suicide being the leading cause of death. AAPI families, as we all know, we don't talk about this issue quite enough, so I really want to open up that conversation here. But I want to start with you, Noel. Yeah. You know, I want to ask you the most basic question I think we don't often ask each other enough. How are you doing?
Well, it's been 2 years now since the incident happened, and well, I think I'm doing well because I've been able to do my work, but still I don't do the subway.
Why?
Because I think it's unsafe to be on a subway. It's not really the trauma of going into the subway. It's just that the news every day, there's something happening in the subway. So if it's safe already going to the subway, I don't think it's a trauma for me to going back there. In fact, I can still even go downstairs and look for how the subway looks now. But still, because of the many incidents that are happening in the subway now, I still don't feel safe. Not only for me, but even for other riders too. And because of my mobility now, you know, going around New York is really a subway thing. So if I don't do the subway, so I really don't go around the New York that much. So that my mobility was hampered.
You know, I recently learned that you had an opportunity to have some work done on the scar on your face, but you opted not to. Is that correct? You chose to stay with that to remind you of something?
Not really, but it becomes my my trademark already. The scars, and it reminds other people also that the Asian hates committed to us by other people. So it becomes a trademark, and it's also an advocacy of providing awareness to other people that Asians are not here for to be a target, but we're here to be a good model of a good citizen.
Liz, you've also turned pain into purpose. You've done so much work in the past several years after what happened to your mother and helping others cope. But how have you coped? How has your mother coped? How are you doing?
Well, that's a loaded question. My mom is doing well. She is physically healed, but the trauma of what happened still lingers with her every day. So even going outside, you know, that's kind of a burden in itself, making sure that I'm almost a emotional bodyguard for my mom every day. For myself, it was a whole question of my identity that I had never thought about before, being half Filipino. And I was just overwhelmed by the love and support that my AAPI community gave to us upon hearing about my mom's incident, and really wanted to use our platform in terms of standing on a soapbox and showing the world that, you know, what happened to my mom wasn't okay, and that Asian hate needs to stop, and seeking justice, but also using our voice to amplify the stories of others so that other people can also feel a bit of encouragement to stand up to get their justice as well.
I want to bring Drew into this. For the viewers who are tuning in who may not be aware of the cultural stigmas that I've been talking about that make it very difficult to address mental health, can you sort of give us an idea of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, my organization, the Asian American Federation, we did a report in 2017 that talked about and looked at the barriers to accessing mental health services. And stigma, even though I would say that's true for all communities, for our community especially, we heard from a lot of our 70 member and partner groups that that's the #1 reason, and research backs this up, is #1 reason why people don't seek mental health support. We've heard in some languages there's not a word for mental health. Instead, there's a word for crazy. So there's this association that talk about mental health challenges, needs, depression, anxiety, especially during COVID, brings with it stigma. And there have been social consequences in different cultural communities that we work with where admitting or seeking help means that you're socially isolated. It might impact your social connections to the community who want to distance themselves from you. It might impact employment prospects, which is true in some home countries. So that stigma that a lot of immigrant communities bring over really is the reason why people feel that asking for help, there's so much shame involved. And we know that during COVID, the depression, anxiety among all communities, but definitely in the Asian community because of anti-Asian violence, and even just witnessing that, even if you haven't experienced it, really led to a surge in mental health needs across communities, across our community, but also demographics among young people, among seniors who really have been the most impacted because of isolation, but also a lot of bullying that we've been seeing online, but also in person.
Yeah, and I'd love to get Dr. Han in here. We know often our seniors suffer from isolation, language barriers, but you hear about the teen suicide rate. I don't assume that they're suffering from isolation, social media, right, and language barriers. You work with a lot of college students, so you've seen, I guess, them carry that from their teenage years. What are we seeing the differences or similarities between the youth and our seniors when it comes to mental health?
Well, I think the young lady that we saw on the screen a few minutes ago really captured how model minority myth dictates even within the family for assimilation to be accepted and to survive is the mode that one has to take on. So even though they might be going to school and they're social, there is still this internal isolation to be perfect, to strive for something that is really impossible. And in order to do that, I think the social contract in this country for Asian Americans is to offer deference, compliance, agreeability, and to not speak up, not to have a voice, not to have the words to express their feelings. And so none of these things are actually shared among their friends. It's all internalized. And so in a way, even though socially they might not look isolated, they are still isolated. And regardless of what's happening, like during the isolation of COVID, a lot of students are experiencing anxiety and depression, but the parents, what they say is, just focus on studying. Get into the specialized high school, study for that, test, or work on your Ivy League college applications. And so there's a real struggle in communicating and not really being able to empathize.
So how do parents address that in the home? Give us some tools.
So I think at the home, one of the things that I wish that were happening is even if the parents speak, let's say, Mandarin or Cantonese, and the kids have lost that because they've been so busy with assimilation, that they would sit and play together. I think that this kind of model minority stereotype takes out any kind of play, any kind of spontaneity, any kind of interactive relational experiences with family members. And so what I mean by play could be just watching a TV show together. It could be just listening to one another for 2 minutes and not actually interjecting. And, they may not understand one another as clearly, but the fact that it allows for the family members to know that they're there for each other. I think that oftentimes the kids don't say anything to the parents because they know how much the parents are sacrificing, and so they don't want to burden. And the parents also don't want to burden their kids by talking about how difficult their day has been.
And you've even seen among our seniors, AAPI seniors, that suicide is also an issue.
So the research finds that among the senior women above age 65, especially Chinese Americans and Japanese American women have the highest suicide rate. And I think Ju and I were discussing in the back room that a lot of times women, older women, end up taking care of their grandchildren, and they may have to move out of their community to live with their children. And then they're isolated, they don't speak English, and they can't go anywhere, they may not drive, and they lack the social support to feel free and to be able to have some independence and their own identity.
Yeah. I do want to pivot into anti-Asian hate crimes, and there's so many resources that, Liz, that your organization has provided. I know, Noelle, you needed a lot of resources to get yourself back on your feet after what happened to you. But before we dive into that, let's see this little montage here that we have. It is a heinous attack that may make you lose your faith in humanity. A 65-year-old Asian American woman on her way to church in Hell's Kitchen, punched and kicked in her stomach. Then her head stomped on not once, not twice, but 3 times. Police said the suspect told the victim, "F you don't belong here." But the insult didn't end there. The callous indifference by the building staff watching the assault not only failed to render aid, but then closed the door on the helpless victim. She is hospitalized with a fractured pelvis and contusion to her head.
A security guard standing nearby and not intervening. Absolutely unacceptable. Look, I don't care who you are. I don't care what you do. You've got to help your fellow New Yorker.
The pain being felt by everyday New Yorkers and elected leaders.
Damn it, I am so sick of standing here demanding something to be done for my people.
So Elizabeth Carey, the daughter of the hate crime victim viciously attacked in Hell's Kitchen, wants to provide comfort in that darkness, a place these days she is all too familiar with.
In some moments thankful, in some moments exhausted, in some moments confused.
Her mother somehow is physically recovering, but her psychological healing has barely begun. She still almost never leaves the house. So a safe space from anti-Asian hate is what Carey created. The online project is called AAPI Belong. Her mother's assailant told her, "You don't belong here," before savagely attacking her.
So I wanted it to be anonymous, where people could almost have the sense of catharsis and share. And on the flip side, if there's people out there that aren't willing to share, but maybe they read the stories of someone else with a similar encounter, they'll feel less alone.
Meanwhile, months before Liz Carey's mother was brutally attacked, Noelle Quintana, while riding the subway in New York, became the face of what would eventually become a movement for equality and inclusion. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Josh Einiger.
Noelle Quintana lost count of the number of stitches it took for doctors at Bellevue to sew his face back together.
I was scared because I thought I was going to die, and nobody helped me.
After a stranger on the subway carved a deep cheek-to-cheek gash, Noelle says he did nothing to provoke.
He started to kick my bag, start kicking my bag. And when I'm about to leave, and then he slashed me.
He was heading to work, minding his own business on a Manhattan-bound L train when this emotionally disturbed man attacked him. When the train pulled into First Avenue, the man ran off. Noelle, gushing blood, staggered onto the platform. Noelle took an Uber home from the hospital. No plans to ride the train again anytime soon. In Kips Bay, Josh Einiger, Channel 7, Eyewitness News.
Now, Liz, so much of what I think struck a chord with what happened to your mother was this feeling of being ignored, being unheard and silenced and marginalized. And Noelle, I want to ask you the same question, but 2 years later, do you feel like there's been some progress there?
I feel like there's been incremental progress, but there's so much more that can happen and so much more that needs to happen. The awareness is just the start, and I think as we're learning more about AAPI identity and we're putting more spotlight on our stories and showcasing and amplifying our voices, this is just the beginning of the work that we need to do to really start to mitigate the hate that we deal with each day.
Noelle, what about you? 2 years later, any better?
No, it's still there. I think the hate is still there, and it's being expanded not only to the Asians, but even to the whole community as well. It's now of a it's more of a gun issues now, instead of just a slap here or a spit there or a slash there. It's more of a mass gun down. And well, most of them are really targeting Asians too, but the community is getting worse now. And the peace and order is getting terrible. And I think it's really more than policing required to fix these issues.
Okay. Jan, you are not only so plugged in to Chinatown here in New York, but Chinatowns, frankly, all across this country. What is the feeling on the ground?
You know, CeFaan, I had the good fortune of attending a conference recently in Vancouver, Canada, that was convened by the Chinatown Vancouver, along with our embassy and consulate, and 18 Chinatowns convened to talk about these issues. And what rose to the surface, unfortunately, is exactly what Noel is saying. Safety is the #1 issue across North America. This is not an American issue by any means. This is also a Canadian issue. And having 18 Chinatowns come together to talk about the state of what we are in right now was very enlightening. And it's being addressed in different ways in different Chinatowns. You know, security is one of the things that is talked about a lot, and how to overcome some of the issues. But I think some of the core here is unity building, and also finding alternatives to colleges and specialized high schools. We need to really think about things that don't get people into trouble to begin with, having better vocational schools and health training.
Councilmember, District 1, your district, includes Chinatown, the Lower East Side, the Financial District. After hearing all of this, 2 years later, where are we?
You know, I think when you walk down the streets, you do see a change, right? 2 years ago today, if you walk down Mott Street, you barely saw anyone. Now we're getting tourism back, you see new businesses open, you see an excitement of a potentially thriving Chinatown on the Lower East Side. However, you also see pantry lines that are wrapped around the block. You see people coming into our government office asking for financial support to pay rent. And so it really shows you the schism of the reality that we live in today, that even though on the surface it looks like we're recovering, a lot of people, especially communities of color, are struggling. And we need to do a lot more for them.
Yeah, and you brought up poverty, right? So many of these issues are connected. And let me sort of weave back in here the mental health part of this, if I can sort of hear from you, Drew. I oftentimes say when somebody says something racist about you, that defines them and not you. But that's a difficult thing to learn how to compartmentalize. I mean, how do we tell ourselves when you're faced with something like that don't allow that to define us?
I mean, the context of AAPI history is really important. There's been, the curriculum being passed and making sure that we learn about the history. But even my mom, who didn't grow up here, asked me, why all of a sudden are they attacking people like us? And without understanding, there's been centuries of anti-Asian violence. So I do think that it's important for all of us, but especially for younger folks who don't have access to that curriculum and that history, that it's not a personal attack, right? When we talk about racism, it's so deeply embedded in the history of this country. We need to understand how to take that context and be able to understand how do we not let that affect our identities, but also turn that into a tool for advocacy the way that Liz and Noel have done. And I want to just reference a little bit about poverty, right? We know, for instance, that post-COVID, 36% of Asian New Yorkers now live in poverty, right? That's a jump from 25% before COVID. So when we talk about the unemployment rates that went up in the Asian community, those pantry lines that are not only in Asian majority neighborhoods, I would say so many neighborhoods across New York, where you see lines and lines of Asian families, but also Asian seniors, it is really important to think about how poverty also affects access to resources. The Asian American Federation's Hope Against Hate campaign, we work with 33 Asian community groups to provide victim support services, safety trainings in Asian languages, as well as training volunteers to be in Chinatown and Flushing and Sunset Park, so that people know that there are people trained in de-escalation to be able to intervene if something does happen, so that Noel and Vilma, when people are targeted, that they're not alone, that people will intervene and know how to safely de-escalate. So we want to make sure that people are connected and don't struggle. I think, Noel, one of the most heartbreaking things that you said coming out of your attack was, no one came to my aid. And I think that for all of us as advocates, it broke our hearts, because no one should go through what you went through and not feel that people don't care. And Vilma, you as well, you had that same response where you said that one person across the street who was filming your incident said, I see you, I'm capturing all of this, and to you that was a comfort. And so our hope through our campaign is to make sure that no Asian New Yorker who is targeted in any way, even though majority are verbal assaults, some are a significant number are physical assaults, no matter what you're going through, you don't have to struggle alone. We can connect you to mental health support. We can connect you to safety trainings in your Asian languages. We can connect you to pro bono legal services so that you don't feel that you're in isolation, even if you are feeling surrounded by your neighborhoods, your neighbors and your community members, that you know exactly where to go for the kind of support that you're seeking.
Yeah, we have a whole segment dedicated to poverty. As I said, this is all connected. You know, when you live under the poverty line, you're vulnerable to violence, you're vulnerable to food insecurity, to lack of access to healthcare and education. But before we move on to that, Liz, I want to ask you, when we spoke about your organization that you launched after this, you described it as a cathartic moment. Talk about that and give us some coping lessons on how you were able to take such pain and turn it into such purpose.
Well, it was a really isolating period, kind of hiding away from the world, taking care of mom, really focusing on that. And people found their way into our hearts by writing us directly. And I was so moved by the kind words of strangers, just people taking time out of their day to write us and share stories that I had never heard, stories not even from currently in the pandemic, but from years beyond. Really our AAPI history that we're not taught in school. And I wanted to create a resource to amplify those stories and hope that I could start with the basics of just sharing a little bit of the education through storytelling of others to showcase the stories and make other people realize that what I was seeing on my side was repetition of a lot of sad stories. And in that sadness, I was hoping that we could create kind of a somber community of all of those that have experienced similar things or empathize with that emotion, and create a sense of self-reflection, belonging, and community conversation, and just start talking about it more.
Repetition of similar stories. What repeated itself?
Just the different stories of being attacked while minding your own business, whether it was current day or 30 years ago. It was talking about someone's parent or grandparent when they moved to North America. Even just the fear, the shame that we've talked about never maybe even telling anyone that story. And that's where I felt so moved to create the platform. Was it felt kind of like an opportunity for someone to safely give their story anonymously, so that there would hopefully not be that idea of shame or stigma, and they could just release it, and using it for the greater good of trying to connect everyone and showcase the story so that other people know that their experiences aren't isolated situations and that this is more of a community effort that we need to look at together.
Right. Dr. Han, moving away a little bit from the violent attacks that they experienced, take me to, I guess, the home, inside the home, where you're raising a young AAPI child, right? And I mentioned how, they could face bias, be told that they're different or other. How do we reassure these very young adolescent API that they are not other, that they are not different, when they may be hearing that every day at school?
Right. Can I just respond to what Noelle and Liz were, just their storytelling is just tremendously powerful, because you guys were just, everyday Americans working. And Noelle's scar, actually, that experience, and Liz's mom's experience, actually brought out a new identity of advocacy, of speaking up. And that's actually a very powerful psychic agency to be able to turn something that has been traumatic and horrific into something that is actually reparational and healing process. It's not an answer to healing, but it's on the way, right? In this kind of struggle in between the loss and this kind of an interminable melancholia that a lot of Asian American families experience. So I think that it's really important to kind of identify why storytelling is important, because on one hand, Asian Americans are seen as good. They're passive, they're hardworking, busy bees. But then they're also seen as bad, where Asian Americans threaten American jobs or they bring diseases. And that's where I think Noelle and Liz's mom were only seen, not as this kind of a very complex human beings, but as Asian Americans are often depicted as perpetual foreigners. And that's all they saw, that phenotypical trait. And they felt entitled to attack. And so I think that the more Asian Americans, especially the youth, begin to tell their stories, because sometimes in therapy, what I really witness a lot is that they come in and they just cry for months because they don't have the words. And they're crying and they're like, I'm sorry, I'm crying. I don't want to cry, I'm always crying. Well, I say, well, that's your first language. We all were born with our first language, which is cry. And crying is universal language. So what are your tears saying right now? Can you translate your tears? And I think to your question, to young Asian American children and youth, I think that we want to really emphasize that we're not alone. We have been here just as long as every other American has put roots. And I think what Ju said about teaching Asian American history, instituting, a lot of children grow up without knowing anything about Asian American history. And this is something that I think Ocean Vuong very beautifully portrays in his poetry. But like May Nai, historian at Columbia, wrote about the Chinese question, which is a seminal book on global diaspora of Chinese migration and immigration all over the world, including North America. And I think that the more we really begin to share the history with our young children and put into their self-esteem the foundation of being proud of where you come from, and that is at the center. So when somebody bullies you, when somebody calls you, you know, negative names, you can say, well, that's your problem. I'm really fine with who I am, right?
Yeah, and look, we kind of dipped into this issue of poverty. We have more eye-popping statistics that, quite frankly, will shatter the myth. So let's discuss more on the other side of this. Casino, you may think the Flushing senior is about to have a day of fun. But for Chun, this is not about pleasure. This is about survival. Speaking in Korean, he tells me life is tough, so he does this to help make ends meet. Every morning he rides this bus to the Sands Casino in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a 2-hour ride one way. He is one of a countless number of Asian American seniors who make this daily trip. They don't do it to gamble. They do it for this. This is why those seniors ride that bus. When you get off the bus, the casino gives you a $45 credit. They sell this for $38. That bus ride costs $20. So at the end of the day, they pocket $18. Chun sells the credit to a fellow passenger who in turn uses it to gamble. There are a dozen buses that leave for the Sands Casino daily, and they are almost always filled to capacity. On each bus, more than half of the passengers do what Chun does. That means on any given day, there are upwards of 300 to 400 seniors who ride the bus for 4 hours both ways and spend another 5 hours in this waiting room for the next ride back. Some of them are homeless. All of them are living below the poverty line. According to the city's most recent measure, Asian Americans in New York have some of the highest levels of poverty among all ethnic groups, at more than 1 out of every 5 people. Advocates say part of the problem is poverty in the community is often unseen.
They are, hitting homeless, that they are doubling up and tripling up, living in these cubicles that they share with 10 people within a 1-bedroom apartment, for example.
In the meantime, countless seniors like Chun will keep riding these buses. The question is, will anyone care? Now look, the dozens and dozens of Asian hate crime victims who we interviewed throughout that stretch, so many of them were out there collecting cans in the middle of the night. And so that sort of, it gives you an example of this real, struggle the community faces. Jan, among the many hats that you wear,
Hamilton Madison House is, frankly, it's a shining example of a community living together side by side, black, brown, yellow, and not only living together, but helping each other. Years ago, we worked on food insecurity. Talk to me about poverty in the community.
So everything that was said so far in the panel, I can echo from Hamilton Madison House. We experience many of the same issues between young and old. Certainly a rise in thoughts of suicide is not unique to the elderly community. In fact, it's just the opposite. A lot of our young people in the AAPI community, we've seen a rise just in our neighborhood of reports of thoughts of suicide, and that should be very alarming. Also, talking about telling the story, what you're doing here now, I think is very, very helpful in breaking through the stigma of not being able to talk about it. I think that young people seeing this is very important to know that they're not alone, that they are actually supported, even at the television corporate level, that we're being recognized. We have to think about what's working. And one of the things that is working is Project Connect, which allows our social workers and our clinicians to go into the homes of our clients to see their condition, because let's not forget, a lot of people have social isolation for the last couple of years and still are, like Noelle, paralyzed about going to the subway, traveling to see their friends, traveling to see their family. And this is not a community that has smartphones and tablets that they can get online to see other folks and Zoom. This is a community that really is very vulnerable in the sense that their isolation will manifest itself in re-trauma every time they hear another story about another AAPI victim. And so we have to address that through these programs like Connect, which enable us to go into the home, talk to the person, offer care, and very importantly, understand their condition. Some of the people, we don't know if they've been taking care of their own hygiene, taking care of themselves, getting enough food. Imagine being so scared that you don't even want to go to the food pantry. And that's experienced in our community.
Ju, mental health access or lack thereof because of poverty. Talk to me real quick about that, what you're seeing from your point of view.
Well, I think just the fact that we don't have enough mental health resources in Asian languages is a big one. So Hamilton Madison House is one of our mental health partners. Absolutely. We have a coalition of about 6 groups that are providing clinical and non-clinical services. And it's to all low-income South Asian, East Asian communities across New York. And why it's accessible, why that's important is that they actually provide non-clinical ways that people can access mental health services first. So oftentimes there's support groups, there's youth programming where we talk about mental health concepts. Sometimes with seniors, we might do tea time or origami folding. And it's a way to bring people in a non-stigmatized way to talk about mental health challenges. We know in the Asian community, mental health shows up as psychosomatic symptoms where their stomach hurts, they have stress, headaches. And there's a space where people can talk about it, and then our groups will say if someone needs clinical services where they actually might have chronic or severe illnesses, they can then refer them to clinics like Hamilton Madison House. Right. So our whole purpose and aim and leading on making sure that there's enough mental health services for the Asian community is making sure that there's multiple points of access. We created a mental health director during COVID because we were hearing from so many community members that mental health needs were rampant across the community. We set it up to make it cost effective and cost accessible as well as language accessible. So on our website, aafederation.org, you can actually go there and access over 200 providers that speak over 19 Asian languages, 34, up to 34 actually with Chinese and Arabic dialects, who can either support you in actually providing clinical mental health services, or you might say, hey, I lost my job during the pandemic. I actually need workforce development support. Then they can connect you to a group that can help you with that, right? So it's not just therapy is very important, and we want to make sure that you get it if that's what you need. But there's other ways that we can support your mental health that have been impacted in different ways during COVID.
Okay. Well, communities that live in poverty often are the same communities that are disenfranchised, and disenfranchised communities often have policies that are not in the best interest of the community. So with that being said, let's discuss that on the other side of this.
No new jails! No new jails! It is the beginning of their last stand. A human chain on Baxter Street, blocking construction crews this morning in Chinatown. From starting work on a new jail, they are desperate. They are livid.
Shame on you for making money off the backs of people of color!
Evelyn Yang, wife of former presidential and mayoral candidate Andrew Yang, among those arrested.
Hearing Mayor Adams, his own words, calling this jail institutionalized hate against Chinatown, and making the promise last year when he was campaigning to the people of Chinatown that he would not allow this jail to go up if he were mayor. And then going back on his word How dare you make this promise to people who have suffered so much and then turn your back on them?
The new jail at the site of the Manhattan detention complex known as the Tombs, part of the city's plan to close Rikers Island.
You can renovate this, it will cost much less, and you can achieve the goals everyone wants.
It's hard to find anyone who would argue that this proposed jail would be great for Chinatown, and that's just the fact, right? Rather, the argument tends to be, well, where else will you build a jail in Manhattan? Jen, respond to that.
So, first of all, I want to talk about the fact that Chinatown has done its share in terms of having a jail in Chinatown area since 1838. So I think that we stand as witnesses to the fact that every time a jail is built at that location, they've torn one down and built one bigger. Now we're at the point where the scale of this jail is, for those of you who don't know, taller than the Statue of Liberty, extending in a couple of blocks in every direction, a basic monolith of a jail. And so what we're saying is that there's so many answers that have not been given to our community starting 4 years ago. You often hear about the mayor talking about a plan B. He hasn't shared that with anyone. We often talk about the fact that the budget is not supported because it was talked about in 2018. It's never been rectified. A lot has happened since 2018, but we're still looking at a plan that we feel is extraordinarily dangerous for our community, digging a gigantic pit into the ground, destabilizing the buildings around it. We have asked the city the questions of how they're going to move forward on this plan. And as of Friday of Memorial Day, they told us we're not interested in negotiating anymore, and we're going to start tearing these jails down with no builder, no plan, no new budget, and no way forward. We're about to embark on something incredibly dangerous in Lower Manhattan, and the city is not giving us answers about how that's going to happen.
Now, since you invoked the mayor and the city, as of this morning, we'll show you the city's most recent statement on this. In order to comply with all legal requirements and ensure the safety of Lower Manhattan community, the administration is dismantling the Tombs and moving forward with a plan to build a more humane facility. The administration has engaged deeply and extensively with community members and elected officials over the last 17 months, including hosting 24 briefings. Council member, there was once a point early in this fight where it was no jail at all in Chinatown. That moment has sort of passed, and as we saw in that package, the new argument has been to repurpose the detention center. Tell us about what that proposal was.
As Jan said, we've been fighting for this fight for the past 4.5 years. And we finally came up with a plan where we thought it was a win-win-win solution. A win for the mayor, a win for the people that would be incarcerated, and a win for the community by doing adaptive reuse at this space. And we proposed him not only with our emotions, our opinions, with our protests in the streets, but with expert engineers to say this can be done at this site. And what we've seen is our community's voices continuously ignored. And we feel like this is symbolic on how the city treats a lot of communities of color. We talked about systemic racism. The mayor himself said that this is an example of that. And so when you look at not only land use decisions that happen in our community, but also on the legislative front, where you have home attendants working for 24 hours and only getting 13 hours of pay, that's wage theft, and that contributes to the poverty that we see in a lot of these communities. And on the budget front, when you look at the population of the AAPI community, they make up of 18% of New York City population, and only growing, the fastest growing community, while only getting 2% of city funding. So it just shows the lack of representation, the lack of inequity that's all systemic.
Here's the city's response. We'll show you to the proposal to repurpose the detention center. The administration even paused work for 2 months in early 2022 and again partially in 23 to evaluate alternative proposals. Based on a thorough analysis, the administration's team of experts and engineers determined that our plan would be faster, save millions of taxpayer dollars, and limit disruption to the community. Councilmember, your response to that?
Well, if we have already seen through the procurement process of the Brooklyn site, where that site alone, pre-construction, is going to be $1 billion over budget, and it won't have a completion date until 2029. Chinatown is the last of the 4 jails in that process. This is going to be done way over budget and nowhere within the foreseeable future. And so when we talk about what's the quickest, what's the most efficient, and what's the most humane process for the people that will be there and the community around it is adaptive reuse. And that's why the community has been pushing this for a year plus now. And we're going to continue to talk to the administration, find ways where we could find a win-win solution. But till now, we feel like our voice hasn't been heard. Like Jan said, we've been asking questions about safety, about construction, about the timelines, about the cost, and we haven't been given that information.
Jan, I often hear the argument this would never happen on the Upper East Side. That's the obvious one. Let me ask you a different question. Would this ever happen in Harlem?
Unfortunately, it is happening in the South Bronx, and that is a predominantly black community. It's at a spot not unlike Chinatown, where we would rather have seen a community center there. We would have rather had seen a lot of things there. So this is something that's being foisted upon, like a lot of unwanted land use issues. They're put into communities of color. But going back to the issue that you said about the safety's response, the issue of safety coming from the city, I think it's really ironic that it's been our community that's been raising the red flag about safety and how dangerous it is to construct on this site. Let's be reminded that on the campus, sharing the wall with the existing jail is low-income senior housing, 88 units. The average age of the person in there is 85 to 90 years old. We visited them. Chris and I visited that site, talked to those people. And you want to talk about mental health and anxiety and unknowns. They're all suffering from that now. And you know, the city hasn't visited them and talked to them and talked to how they're going to dig underneath this foundation, how unstable it is. We've read the reports. We know that this is an insanely dangerous endeavor that they're embarking upon.
Let me end with one last question on this topic to you, council member, before we move on to some final thoughts from all of you. The administration argues that this was the previous administration's doing, that they're just following the law set by the council. They might even point out that it's the Progressive Caucus that's keeping this from changing. So true or false, council member, can the council prevent this from happening? Can it stop it?
I think it's false. You know, the rezoning was voted on in 2018. What's happening now is that it just changed the use of a land, how much you can build and the scope of the building. We can keep the same site and it's still within the laws and the jurisdictions that were passed during the rezoning. And so there's no laws that needs to change. What we need is political will and political action.
This was a vibrant discussion. We can go on all day, but final thoughts, let's go down the line, a minute each. Noel, final thoughts you want viewers today to take away with them?
Again, please.
Your final thoughts, just on everything we discussed.
I think the discussion on Asian hates, suicide on Asian elders and youth should be ongoing and should be so that we would be educated on what's happening in our community and what are the things that we should have done to prevent this. And
Liz?
Yes, as well. I mean, I think I learned a lot of things today, actually, even things I didn't know coming into this panel. And with that, I just go back to the idea of the importance of education, and whether it's storytelling or education about resources and how to access them, mental health, just with a community that is facing so much trauma and challenge in these upcoming years, it's just the importance of coming together and being able to kind of spotlight what's difficult for us. And I say this often to the community, you know, how can we ask others to help us if we won't help ourselves? And so a lot of what I do is a lot of self-reflection, just to encourage others to have a voice, and hope that by showcasing our stories and making it a little bit more familiar to even those outside of the AAPI community with our allies, what can seem as foreign and strange will be something a little bit more common and accepted. And hopefully what is understood will lead to less discrimination and hate.
Ju?
I would say I want to make sure that as we talk about stories, that the people understand that the crisis has not passed. Anti-Asian violence continues to be a concern. We don't want to see more stories like Noel and Vilma. We don't want to have Cecile Lai and people like Cecile Lai and her son being assaulted. We want to take this moment to think about how can we as New Yorkers learn more about the Asian community, right? Not in just during May, during AAPI Heritage Month. We really urge New Yorkers, come to the Federation's website, learn about poverty, learn about language access, learn about the different issues that are impacting our community. We are a research center so that we do know the Asian community is the fastest growing in New York City, in the state, in the country, but in some council districts, we are not only the fastest growing, but we're making up some of the fastest growing demographics. So I would urge you to ask your council members, what are you doing to make sure that your community members, your constituents are being supported with victim support services, are being supported with mental health services, so that it's not on the most vulnerable members of our community to take it upon themselves to seek that help.
Dr. Han?
Well, I've learned so much today, and I think that one of the things that's really coming to me, because I work individually with people, is that there's systemic racism and institutionalized discriminations, and all these layers of history that has been assaulted onto Asian Americans is being, each one of us are carrying all of those burdens. And so when we began the talk with suicide rate among youth and the elderly, well, no wonder. We're carrying so much what David Ng and I call racial melancholia, these everyday struggles to really work through all of these things. And the way that we can do it is actually, all of us come from different sectors, but we're all working together. And I think that kind of learning from one another and coalition building and community work together is really key to the next, I just want to commend all of your work and all of your work. So thank you.
Jan.
I think that going to that, I keep referencing this conference of 18 Chinatowns. I think that movement is going to grow, and I think that the hashtag Chinatown Solidarity is going to be something that we're all going to rally around in the next few months and weeks. But what that does is it shines a spotlight on our administrations to no longer be racist toward us as AAPIs. There's so much of what we suffer that is built into the government system that causes bad things to be dumped into good neighborhoods. And that solidarity of 18 Chinatowns across North America is really going to shine a spotlight on the people who are doing the right thing, and certainly the people who are doing the wrong thing in our government. And so we're not alone as Chinatown, but we're not alone as AAPIs. Thanks to programs like this, I think we have the unity building that's really necessary.
And last but not least, Councilman Lamarte.
I want to tell the viewers that you can get involved. If you care about the Chinatown jail fight, look up NUBC, Neighbors United Below Canal Street. If you want to research the organizations that AAF, Asian American Federation, supports, go to their website. If you care about wage theft and home attendants working inhumane hours, 24-hour shifts, join and support the Ain't I a Woman campaign. Every single person can play the part to make sure that your community, your voice is heard, and so we can end this systemic racism.
It's a good time to remind folks watching that the QR code at the bottom of your screen provides links to all of these resources that are out there. And I do want to sort of end with a status check, because we talked about throughout this discussion AAPI history curriculum. And so just real quick status check here. More than a dozen states have introduced and passed this, including New Jersey and Connecticut. In New York, this bill has been introduced, but it has not passed yet. I will just say I think it's important, sort of the mental health angle of this, that this curriculum being taught, this history being taught, is not just for the non-AAPI. Years ago, we profiled a remarkable, at the time, 13-year-old Ashlyn So, designer who was at her third Fashion Week in New York, and caught me off guard. I didn't think that a 13-year-old growing up in the Bay Area in today's day and age would have trauma, frankly, from bias and racism. And she has been pushing this curriculum to be taught in her county. And so I think it's important to realize that this is also important for AAPI youth to recognize their place in the society. And when it's not taught, you do feel quite invisible. So that's something I want to sort of end on. But look, this was a thoughtful and meaningful conversation, certainly one that cannot end with just 1 hour. So we hope you continue this conversation with your loved ones, with your neighbors. We'll have a link to this full town hall posted on ABC7NY So please share it with someone, and you'll find links to the many resources we talked about there as well. So let's keep talking, and thank you for joining us.